Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly livestock market update. I'm news anchor reporter Meghan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Hey, good afternoon, Megan.
Scott, let's get right into it and talk a little bit about what happened this week in the livestock markets and if there's anything we should really take note of.
Yeah, so when I think looking specifically at cattle and hog prices first, hog prices for the most part pretty flat for the week as not much change has happened. On the cattle side, we actually saw some stronger prices. Feeder steers and heifers, they were up $3 to $8 a hundred for this week, and we also saw fed cattle prices higher for the week as well, up about $6. So some price strength that we saw on the cattle side, and hog prices continuing to hold fairly strong or fairly flat as we went through the week.
Scott, as we talk about the livestock market, I guess we can't help but think about the grain side of things as well. USDA released their planted acreage report yesterday. Talk to me a little bit about that report and maybe a little bit of surprises built in there somewhere.
Absolutely. I think when you look at what we got out of the crop reports yesterday, and I'll say both acreage and grain stocks are important in this discussion from a livestock perspective. First of all, over 94 million acres of corn being planted in that June acreage report. It tells me if that's in fact correct, we could have a fairly large crop in the bin this fall. And I think we've talked a lot about yields, but weather seems to be fairly good. You look at crop conditions, and they're in fairly good shape for the most part in the country. It seems to me that the pressure for lower feed costs are coming in front of us, not much pressure for higher feed costs. And I think from a livestock perspective, that's good. If we can continue to see some cheaper feed, it helps offset some of the lower cattle and hog prices that we see this year relative to the past couple of years. I think on the soybean side as well, increases in soybean area. Maybe we didn't quite get to the average pre-report guess when we look at soybean acres, but still a lot of soybeans planted in the country as well. And you look at both corn and soybean stocks out of the stocks report, and both of those higher than we expected. So more current short-term supplies as well as more acreage than we would have saw from the planting intentions report. Just tells me some lower feed costs are coming. I add on top of that, we don't talk about it very often, but hay acreage up quite a bit relative to what we saw earlier in the year. Suggesting to me that hay prices might continue to be relatively inexpensive as well. So I think all of those things added together tells me the cost side of the equation seems to be in pretty good shape, and it would take a pretty strong dry weather event at this point to really change that tune from what we got out of this last acreage report.
And while they have been sporadic, there has been some pretty timely rains this week for that crop to maybe even get us to fruition as we inch closer to it being in the bin.
Absolutely. I think, when you look back at, I think many of us would say, boy, we went from what we thought was a really good crop in early June to by the time we got a July WASDE from USDA, it was clear things were crumbling very quickly. You look at the crop conditions report today, and 2016 is nowhere close to the declines we were already seeing in 2012. So I think we're in a very different situation in terms of where that crop is already. And again, it will take a pretty severe weather event, I guess, across the country to make a big dent at this point in time.
Scott, it was a big topic last week and still is really a topic of conversation this week. We talked a lot about Brexit and that vote in the UK and what it meant then. We're a week out. Any difference or any other thoughts as the markets have had time to digest and process that vote?
Yeah, so I will say that there's still a lot of uncertainty when you look at that Brexit activity, and I'll say it comes from a lot of different directions. First of all, you hear a lot out of Europe, and exactly when will Britain leave the EU? Is it going to happen quickly? Is it going to take a long time? Does it happen post Cameron stepping down? Does it not? I think all of that still adds a lot of uncertainty. But when you look at, I'll just take the stock market for this week. We certainly saw a pretty good decline in the Dow Jones through the first part of the week, but we've recovered a fair amount of that already. So seems like to me the major markets have already really started to suggest a much smaller effect. I think from an ag perspective, there's still some things that we should be paying attention to, and primarily that's what happens to exchange rates. I do worry the dollar will strengthen as a result of what we see in Brexit relative to some competitors that could supply some beef and pork to other markets. So those are the things I think we're going to have to continue to watch. But at this point, just the timing of when everything happens, this is a pretty historic move that hasn't happened very often, and trying to figure out exactly that path forward, I think, is pretty difficult.
Scott, we didn't get to it last week. One of the things that we probably should talk about this week are those cold storage numbers from USDA last week. Anything that we need to take out of there, and how is it relating to the domestic and the supply of meat that we have?
Yeah, so I keep looking at meat stocks and saying, it shows us actually some fairly good news. I think when you start looking across beef, pork, and chicken in total, and first of all recognizing that chicken's been the meat that's shown the largest increase in terms of ending stocks. I look at year-to-date stocks of beef, pork, and chicken and say, we're up 0.4% relative to the same period a year ago. That's pretty good, given that when you look at meat production of those three meats, we're up about 2.8% year-to-date relative to 2015. So it tells me that as we've seen domestic meat production grow in this country in 2016, the good news is we're not putting it straight in the freezer. A lot of that's moving either to domestic consumers or at least to consumers in other countries. So some good news in the standpoint of now that we are talking about increases in meat supplies, we're actually seeing consumers both in this country and around the world willing to consume more U.S. meat product. If we can keep that up as we move ahead, I think that gives us a lot more reason to be optimistic about where prices for beef and pork can go as we move through the remainder of 2016 and into early 2017. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we're going back to the record highs that we saw a couple of years ago, but I also don't want to revisit record lows that we saw not that long ago as well. So that demand move, I think, certainly can be helpful. I'm really interested to see what we get in terms of monthly trade data next week, as we'll finally get some May estimates in terms of trade with the report next week.
One of the other reports, Scott, that we talk about is that restaurant performance index, correct?
That's correct.
Let's talk a little bit about what we saw in that report.
Yeah, so we did get a restaurant performance index this week. The May information showed the restaurant performance index at 100.6. That level of growth is less than what we saw in April when we were at 101.6. But I remind folks that anytime that index is above 100, we tend to think about that as expansion. Now, a 0.6 isn't a lot, but I remind us that that's a much better situation than we were in tough times when we were well below 100. So that index hasn't grown a lot from April to May, but at least we are not on the negative side. And again, I keep focusing on running additional meat supplies at consumers. We need them to make sure they're optimistic in terms of their what ultimately will be their demand for meat products, and that report at least doesn't suggest any large roadblocks coming ahead as we again push more meat supplies at all market segments.
Scott, have a happy and safe 4th of July weekend.
Megan, you do the same.
And next Friday, I won't see you via computer. We'll be together in Jefferson City. So I look forward to seeing you then.
Same here. Take care.
Thanks, Scott. I'm Meghan Grebner for Brownfield.